Hails and welcome to Rauta's Crash Course to Norwegian Black Metal since the 90s, episode 15. Now this crash course has been running for many months now, and with each episode 3 bands have been mentioned, starting with the biggest ones and then going through the mid-sized ones towards the smaller ones or cult acts. No denying that today's episode feature actually more of a less cult acts. These are not big bands, even though they have been in the game, in the scene for a lot of years, 30 years or so. And of course these bands have been making waves. Minor waves compared to the big ones coming from Norway. That is, we're not even nowhere near about bands like Mayhem, Darkthrone, Emperors, Satyricon, Dimmu Borgir and the like. But these bands, even though smaller in size, maybe cult acts as such, not so active in terms of releasing new albums, these bands have paved their way with their own style. Maybe not necessarily unique in all factions, well, except one, I guess. But nonetheless, these bands have been making quality music from various parts of Norway. And as always, we'll go somewhat in chronological order in today's episode as well. So the bands today are Trelldom Isvind and Mysticum. Welcome to Norwegian Black Metal. So we'll start with Trelldom, which started as early as 1992. I mean, of course, nowadays it seems like they have been in the game for eternity. But if you really go back to the previous episodes where I featured the really early birds, bands like Mayhem, Darkthrone, Burzum, Enslaved, which already had some stuff out like 1991. Now 1992 might sound like only a little bit late to the party, but when we're talking about releasing the first albums, bands like the aforementioned names or also Immortal, some bands already had albums out by, say, 1991. So, for example, where Darkthrone and Mayhem started in late 80s, and even some of the bands as like 1989, 1990, now coming 1992 is a little bit late. And this is sometimes excused by the age difference. When some other guys were like 23, if you were like 18, the age difference were big. This alone explains some of the differences, how some bands did album or demo a couple of years later. But Trelldom was 1992, so very early on still, especially if you took it like in hindsight, where some bands were started like 1995, 1996 or so. But it took a couple of years before that demo was out, 1994. And that was soon followed by the very first album, Til Evighet. Now, all these 3 albums, what Trelldom has been doing, you will see a pattern. They all start with Til. It's Til Evighet, Til et annet, Til minne, and all ending with triple dots. Style has been always pretty much the same. What started in 1995 has been, until 2007, quite alike the same. So even though there is like 12 years gap between these albums, and of course the lineup has changed a lot, the main focus, main core if you will, has been always pretty much the same. Now a lot of bands and a lot of people will probably remember Trelldom by Gal, the now ex-Gorgoroth vocalist. But Trelldom was there before he joined Gorgoroth. And of course later on there had been bands like Godseed or Gal's Word. So Gal never ceased to be active in the black metal scene. But he wasn't exactly the same places as a lot of those names, namely Bergen and Oslo, the capital and the other capital city, both in terms of Norwegian history, but also in terms of what is like, what are the places, the sites, the scenes for Norwegian black metal. Bergen has a lot of bands, of course, obviously, but also Oslo was a very, very important band, not only for Mayhem and Darkthrone, but other bands as well. But there were lots, of course, other parts in the Norwegian scene, geographically kind of an interesting shaped country, and that means that also these kind of satellite places were born in different places. And Trelldom is, in a way, one of those bands that kind of proved the very point. You don't have to be in one of those 2 cities in order to see the black metal happening in various places in the 90s. Now, like I said, Trelldom kind of defined their own sound very early on, and they never gave it up. Luckily so, because in my opinion, Trelldom kind of showcases a lot of that kind of black metal. This is very grim, very icy, but not going, in the terms of or waves or shapes and sizes and whatever, to the world of sophisticated black metal. Not to mention overly melodic or, atmospheric parts. I mean, there are styles which are like, almost like avoiding the typical second wave black metal sound, and that is when bands go really like jolly or very symphonic or atmospheric so much it's almost like going away whatever the core of black metal is. Now, that doesn't mean that Trelldom is one of the most raw of black metal bands. I mean, of course, there are plenty of those bands, some of which I have featured already, like Iliarn. But Trelldom is more on the grim side of things. There's certain kind of a Darkthronian vibe with the music, where the riffs are, through all of these albums, quite, how to say, punkish, or how stripped down in ways. That means the music is not very complex. And also there are kind of like hypnotic patterns on some of the songs where there's a lot of repetition, not so much changing themes or vibes and all that stuff. Now, this is not the fastest and the most aggressive band out there coming from Norway doing black metal. It's not most evil sounding. It's not the darkest one. I mean, there are plenty of bands that you could go for if you're looking for a certain kind of extremity when it comes to black metal. But I think throughout these 3 albums, which I think are the better side of Norwegian black metal, all these 3 albums kind of showcase that you don't have to do so much complex songwriting. You don't have to be sophisticated. You don't have to add layers and layers of keyboards or any kind of superlative melodies there in order to make it worthwhile. That is certain kind of a dark throne, but less rawness. So in a way, kind of a more to the, how to say, core or general definition of Norwegian black metal. In one way, Trelldom could be in a center of Norwegian map in terms of like that. So like here are the bands that went very melodic, or here are the bands with sophisticated and, symphonic and all, and here are the bands that went atmospheric, and if you go that way, you will find a lot of rawness, barbarism, and all that stuff. So, in a way, Trelldom sits in the very center of things. Not the fastest, not the darkest, not the rawest, not the most symphonic, not the atmospheric. I keep saying these things because I want to point out that there are lots of bands when you're thinking about Norwegian black metal, and you could really drop down these words, and you could be basically describing Trelldom. Of course, it had Gal's vocals, and even though the lineup has changed, if you take a look at the nowadays members list, it's a little bit different than what it was in 1992. But mind you, you still have a couple of early members, like on bass and guitars, these members who were there like already in 1997, which means only the first demo was a little bit different lineup. But Gal has been there as the vocalist, the original member of the band, pretty much just always. Past members list is quite vast for a band that had only the 3 albums. But then again, this already shows that some of the early members like probably came in, left, and all that stuff. Not that really unusual for a lot of bands. In my opinion, Trelldom is one of those bands that should have gotten more attention. But then again, only with 3 albums out and only 2 of them coming in relatively short amount of time span means that it was probably kind of going out of the radar for a lot of bands which were active. The bands that were releasing new albums every couple of bands, say Gorgoroth or Darkthrone or, I don't know, Immortal. You will see that those bands were just so much active, constantly getting new audience, and kind of confirming the existing ones, versus when you have a band that has suddenly has a hiatus for many, many years. This is how brutal music industry and scene can really be. I mean, if you're not relevant all the time, you can never get left out. I don't think it never bothered people of Trelldom and a lot of those who are true to the whatever core of black metal Norway or other way, but just saying that this is a very understandable reason why bands like this can just fall out of the good graces in so many ways. In my opinion, all these 3 albums are still definitely recommended. I would even say they're kind of a mandatory listen if you want to understand Norwegian black metal, as opposed to the bigger ones which are just kind of like too obvious. But there it is. I hope you will check them out in case you still haven't. Then Isvind from Oslo, which could have really been the very, very core of the things. And once again, this could have been a band that would have been making waves. Now, they were like there pretty early on, 1992, releasing demos, an EP, and the kind of a classic album, Dark Water Stir, 1996. So pretty much quite early on. What happened? Now, I don't know the details why suddenly there was this big stop. 1997 says Metal Archives. And if you take a look at the members list, you will see a couple of early members and a couple of latecomers. So basically there was a little bit of a gap. The band basically, in essence, kind of falling apart, I guess, would be the right choosing of words, which means that nothing really happened since 1996, 1997. Once again, bringing the very same point as with Trelldom, the band kind of vanished, ceased to exist, which means for a lot of years, this band, Isvind, as it was originally said, basically ceased to exist. So whatever they restarted in early 2010s with coming with these 3 new albums, I mean, they kind of had to restart the whole engine. But of course, the momentum was already gone. I'm now talking about in terms of commercial success, but also how much waves you can go, make in the scene. A good example is Ember ceased to do music almost around 20 years ago. They're still relevant. Why? Because they tour. They don't have to do new music. Not more than 20 years, and basically they're using only the 2 early albums as a stuff, and they're still being worshipped, they're still very successful and all that stuff. Whereas bands like this, having released as many albums, well, basically you're next to nobody because you were gone when things were changing, when there was this momentum. Now, when it comes to music of Isvind, I would say much like Trelldom, it's a kind of a basic default version of Norwegian black metal. I still think that Dark Water series is pretty good of an album, but for me it never made that big of an impact. Don't get me wrong, I consider it a good album, but there is a difference between good classic and a great one. So while Dark Water Stir is definitely, despite its kind of a early, somewhat rawish, unpolished, but also kind of a typical Norwegian 1990s sound, I mean, it's very, very listenable and to a certain degree quite enjoyable. It isn't actually the same level as I would say, some of those early Immortal or Burzum or Enslaved or whatever Satyricon albums you have out there, not to mention Dark Throne and the like. But it's something that could have really been evolving something very, very powerful entity if only they got it going. But sometimes there is a reason why some bands just cease to exist and something else happens. Sometimes people move on, some have families, some move to a different band and whatever, and then things just fall apart. Been there, done that with my own band, so I pretty much know what I'm talking about. However, when they came back, Isvind that is, in 2010s or so, well here it says 2002, but come on, let's be real. Whatever you had 2002 resulted only as a split and demo early 2000s, and then almost 10 years difference before the first new album was coming out, 2011, followed by 2013, 2015 albums, and even ever since, 8 years difference. I mean, 8 years ago when Good was released. That is to say, the band has somehow managed to keep up the level, but obviously it's not so easy to do a timeless classic in, say, 2013 as back in the days in the 90s, because of course the audience is different, the generations have changed. I mean, whoever were 20s in the 90s, like me, well, now come 2013 or so, you're more like in your 40s. Which brings us to the point, some of the audience have already left. So those who actually remembered your band are now gone, moved on, maybe entirely leaving the metal scene. And those who are now 20s in 2013 or so, might not be interested in or not even know bands like this. Doesn't matter what the quality of music is because it's a new band. So everybody might know Burzum and the old big bands coming from the 90s because they're still relevant. Everybody keeps talking about them. There's certain kind of a hype. It's kind of even trendy still after more than 30 years in the making, whereas these new bands are just, overshadowed by the biggest names. But that is not to say that Isvind never stopped being relevant. It just kind of gone off the radar. Happened for me as well, even though I've been reviewing albums more than 20 years. But I don't know. For example, if I take a look here, Intent Lever from 2011. I don't even know this Kyrk Productions and Armor label. So at least for I can say, these never came as a review copy, whereas a lot of black metal bands kept coming. Folter Records is a little bit bigger, but not exactly that much doing promotion versus a lot of other bands. So all I'm saying that I'm just using myself as an example of review work, where a lot of other bands were promoted constantly, promos being sent, interview requests, and blah 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 happening. Isvind kind of fell off the radar, and that's probably one of the reasons why nobody keeps talking about the bands, and when they do, they keep talking about the debut album. I don't think these other three albums so much pale in comparison, but let's be honest about it, it's hard fight to get back to the headlines, get touring and all that stuff when you're basically a forgotten entity. It's too bad for them, but I think still, this being said, Isvind is something that you should give a go if you didn't do it back in the days. I would say it's much like Trelldom in terms of the central point of kind of a default Norwegian black metal band, but not as good. That doesn't mean the music is not useless. I think it's actually worth listening to any of these albums. But it's somewhat of a, not to mention it in a mean comment, but it's more like a B-level act versus those A-level names. Not only in terms of success, but more like the songwriting. But pretty solid still nonetheless. Which leads us to the last band here in the episode, called Mysticum. One of the predecessors, one of the first names of industrial black metal. And this is a curious case because this was already there also early 90s. Now, if you take a look here on Metal Archive site, you will see that they basically were existing in the 1991 era already with a different name and then changing names, probably style as well. But Mysticum were more or less started in 1993, which soon followed by a demo, then split with Ulver. Mind you, these guys actually shared members a little bit, so there's that. But it took a couple of years, so 1996, the legendary album In the Streams of Inferno, one of the defining albums of industrial black metal, came to be. I remember getting this on CD around 1999 probably, and I remember liking it because it was very dark album. I mean, it still is obviously, but it was making with this drum machine and all that stuff and creating this industrial vibe, basically something that no other bands did. I mean, Thorns were there, but I heard Thorns afterwards, and Thorns' debut album, I mean, it came later, even if Thorns as a band is older than Mysticum. The point here is, pretty much before this era, 1996 or so, bands were not doing this kind of black metal. There might have been some demo acts, and of course, Mysticum had already been existing for a few years, but when we are talking about albums, there basically were no industrial black metal albums so much going on in this era. Why it's definitely worth mentioning, this is definitely a pioneer album in so many ways. It's debatable whether Mysticum was one of the first ones, but I would say if it wasn't the first, really to nail it down, it was definitely one of the first ones. And I think still most other bands doing the same genre are not able to do the quality. There are bands which are pretty good in the same sub-genre. Bands like Diabolicum from Sweden or what the hell is this band? Aberum from Italy. I mean, they're basically doing that. And then there are bands from other parts of Europe which are basically like Black Lodge, France, if I remember correctly. Basically, they are challenging the very same style. But this is often overlooked, and maybe for a reason. I mean, it's kind of a challenging genre to begin with. Blending industrial music to black metal and making sounding so it works, that it makes sense. And Mysticum totally delivers, both on stage, seen a couple of times, as well as on albums. Planet Satan was an album that was supposed to come after In the Streams of Inverno so many times. I remember the rumors when it said like they recreated and remade the album, but some tapes were lost or whatever. So it took almost like 20 years, the band, to actually surface with Planet Satan, which is still a good album, but doesn't have the magical element that In the Streams of Inferno has. But it's a good successor to the debut album, and it's only shame that the band hasn't been that active with the music. I mean, there's like a live album, but live albums kind of a suck in terms of studio albums, at least in this respect. And then there are these splits and compilations and whatever, but like said, it's the albums that really, really challenge you. Can you put few songs, say 8 to 12 songs on the full album, make it sound it's like current, consistent, consistent in style and quality and all, make it like lasting testimony, whatever you have been doing. And I think Planet Satan is definitely a good example that you can be, you can have like 18 years of difference and still make it worthwhile. Of course, there might be some really, really old tracks and ideas, but that doesn't mean that you get to actually do and finish the whole album to 18 years later and say like, here it is, go and enjoy. It's the similar style that we started, because always like said, people get older. So when you were like 20s and 90s, suddenly you're 40 in your 2010s, and so mindsets change, people change with their ideas, what they want to do, how they want to represent themselves and all that stuff. But yeah, Mysticum is definitely one of those bands that totally deserve their the attention of the audience and, the praises, even worship of creators of the given style. It's only shame that they didn't do more albums. Of course, it's hard to say if the quality would have been there had they been making the albums all the time. But if I had to put my money on it, I would say, yeah, they could have been making many albums, even if the style would have changed a little bit, or maybe just doing what they know best and doing albums. So it's a shame that there are only like 2 good albums out of the band, which has been here for 30 years and more. All these cult names, in my opinion, are definitely worth checking out. They are even, in a way, a lot better than some of the more famous ones, the more successful ones, which kind of proves that Norway is so much more than the biggest one, the most successful bands. But I think, much like this video will get overlooked and people will ignore it, it's kind of a shame that people will also forget a lot of these bands because they're not making big headlines, they're not touring all the time and announcing new album every 2 years and all. So a lot of these bands, Trelldom Isvind, Mysticum, they will be not forgotten, but they will go under the radar, so to speak, for a lot of people out there. Even these people would probably like a lot these bands on albums or live if they only got the chance to listen to them. So I hope that you who are watching this video will check these albums out and spread the word, spread the fucking love, man. Because the thing is, albums like these, they should not be forgotten, they should be spread, and people should be talking about them like they're talking about the bigger names, even though these are not the ones making those headlines and all. So off you go. Whatever we will have in episode 16 of the same series, it will be totally different. So meanwhile I'm making that one and preparing for that one, go to check out these albums and I hope you enjoy them. They are good bands, so I am pretty sure you will enjoy them. Until next time, bye bye.